What if I told you that the greatest empire the world had ever seen, Rome, the land of marble triumphs and invincible legions, was rotting from its very core? Not because of foreign enemies, but because its emperors turned their bedrooms into stages of terror, humiliation, and forbidden desire. Behind the glittering facade of power, rulers like Caligula, Tiberius Nero, and Elagabalus created a theater of nightmares where lust was politics, cruelty was ritual, and degradation was law. This is not just history, it is the darkest anatomy of power gone insane. And if you dare to walk with me through the locked doors of the Roman palace, make sure you hit subscribe now, because what lies ahead will shake you far more than any battlefield ever could. To understand this story, we must first strip away the illusions that Rome itself cultivated. For centuries, the empire celebrated discipline, military honor, and public virtue. Statues of emperors rose in every province, presenting them as demigods of order. Yet the truth whispered in corridors carried by terrified slaves and silenced senators was that the true empire was not built on stone, but on flesh. In Rome, sex was not intimacy nor romance, it was power incarnate. The hand that dominated in bed ruled in politics, while the body forced to submit symbolized the conquered provinces stripped of pride and liberty. Roman philosophers may have debated virtue, but the real law of the empire was carved into human skin. Penetration meant mastery, submission meant servitude. This rule stretched from the lowest brothel to the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. An emperor did not simply conquer with swords, he conquered with humiliation. When a senator's wife was forced into the imperial chamber, her husband knew that all his dignity, wealth, and power counted for nothing. And when the emperor paraded his favorites in public Rome's citizens understood no law, no tradition, no god could stand between the emperor and his appetites. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius did not record these scandals as idle gossip. They wrote them down as warnings because, to the Romans, the sexual life of the emperor was not private. It was a mirror of his rule. A man who restrained nothing in bed would restrain nothing in governance. A man who desecrated taboos would desecrate laws. Every orgy, every forced marriage, every degradation was a declaration that the emperor's power reached into the most sacred spaces of life. And so, when we read these tales, we are not peering into bedrooms. We are peering into the very machinery of tyranny. Among the emperors, none looms larger in infamy than Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. In the beginning, he was adored, a young man hailed as Rome's golden boy, the darling of the Praetorian Guard, a restorer of his family's glory. Crowds cheered him as the savior who would heal the empire after years of Tiberius's gloomy isolation. But behind the youthful smile and glittering eyes, shadows stirred. Within 4 short years, his reign descended into nightmares so grotesque that his own guards turned their swords against him, unable to stomach his depravity. Caligula's spiral began where Roman morality drew its sharpest line: the family. He did not merely sleep with courtesans or slaves, he flaunted affairs with his own sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. At banquets, he seated them where only his wife should sit, as if mocking the sanctity of marriage and kinship itself. Senators squirmed in silence, forced to watch their emperor strip away the very pillars of Roman virtue. To the people, it was as though the emperor had set fire to the altar of the household gods and declared that nothing, neither blood nor law, stood above his lust. The true descent came with Drusilla's death in 38 AD. Caligula's grief was no ordinary mourning. It was obsession painted in divine colors. He declared her a goddess, enforced mourning laws that punished laughter, bathing even meals with family. But his greatest tribute was far darker. He turned the imperial palace into a palace of pleasure, a brothel, staffed not by common women but by the wives and daughters of Rome's elite. Senators were summoned, forced to watch their wives with imperial slaves, their pride shattered while the emperor laughed. Caligula charged admission, monetizing humiliation itself. Imagine the scene. Marble halls draped in silk torches, casting shadows on trembling bodies, senators biting their lips in rage as their families were paraded before them. Coins clinked into imperial coffers, while dignity dissolved into smoke. To Rome, this was not just scandal, it was apocalypse. The emperor had turned the empire's most sacred households into a circus of degradation. The whispers of the people grew darker. If the emperor could so easily corrupt Rome's noblest blood, what hope did the common citizen have? Power itself had become pornography. And then came the infamous horse Incitatus. History remembers it as madness, a bizarre story of a ruler who wanted his steed made consul. But behind the laughter lay a crueler joke. Caligula was declaring that his horse deserved more respect than Rome's senators, that the empire's political institutions could be penetrated, mocked, and parodied as easily as their wives. Whether he ever crowned Incitatus or not, the message was burned into Roman memory. The emperor could unmake the republic's dignity with the wave of his hand. Yet Caligula was not alone. Before him, his predecessor Tiberius had retreated to the island of Capri, where he crafted a hidden empire of shadows, more secretive, but no less grotesque. Suetonius tells of elaborate pools, painted chambers, and attendants forced into vile performances in water and stone. The island was accessible only by dangerous paths, as if the emperor had built a fortress to keep his horrors from the eyes of Rome. But nothing could hide the whispers that spread. Capri had become a kingdom of degradation, where Rome's ruler turned the sea breeze into the sighs of the broken. Tiberius, unlike Caligula, did not wear madness on his sleeve. His cruelty was whispered, hidden in shadows, cultivated like a poison in the water. Young boys were brought to his villas. Women were coerced under threat of exile, and the imperial palace in Rome became a distant memory compared to the horrors staged on Capri. Yet the philosophy behind his tyranny was chillingly methodical: power over life and death, pleasure and pain, control over desire itself. Every victim was a lesson, every witness a witness to absolute domination. And then there was Nero, whose reign is often reduced to stories of fiddles and fires, but whose depravity transcended mere spectacle. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD was only the opening act in a theater of cruelty. Behind the flames, Nero indulged fantasies that blurred the line between performance and atrocity. Young boys were made into living statues, women forced to act as animals in grotesque mockery, and the emperor himself performed on stage not for applause, but to assert that the godlike ruler could do anything. Nothing in the world was sacred or untouchable. Nero's obsession with control extended into the most intimate spaces. His lovers, wives, and courtesans were instruments their compliance demanded, their rebellion punished with unspeakable cruelty. Suetonius writes of nights where the palace became a labyrinth of screams and silk, where the emperor tested loyalty by orchestrating humiliation so meticulous it bordered on art. And yet, to the Roman people he was a deity untouchable, as though the city itself had agreed to look away while the heart of Rome decayed. But the grotesque theater of power was not limited to men. Elagabalus, ascending the throne at the age of 14, brought chaos of a different shade. Devoted to the Syrian sun god, he flaunted rites that involved his lovers male and female in ceremonies that scandalized the Senate. He married dozens, divorced dozens, wore wigs and makeup, and even demanded that his attendants address him as a goddess. In Elagabalus, gender morality and hierarchy dissolved. His court became a carnival of subversion, where the empire's very notion of order was mocked by laughter and lust. In each case, the personal became political. Caligula's orgies, Nero's staged humiliations, Tiberius's secret terrors, they were more than indulgences, they were statements. An emperor's bedroom was the control room of the state. By humiliating the elite, corrupting the sacred, and subverting norms, they communicated a terrifying truth. The emperor was law, and law could be violated by the lawmaker at will. Submission was obedience, and compliance was survival. The public, of course, witnessed fragments, rumors carried by merchants, letters intercepted by vigilant clerks, reports whispered in the forum. But even these fragments painted a city teetering on the edge of madness. When Roman citizens went about their daily lives, they moved like shadows through a theater of terror, aware that the rulers of their empire indulged in sins that would destroy any ordinary man. The city itself became complicit, a stage where morality was optional and survival required silence. These stories, recorded and exaggerated by historians, reveal a deeper truth about human nature and the intoxicating power of unchecked authority. When the ruler is godlike, the ordinary boundaries of shame, taboo, and decency collapse. In Rome, emperors were gods in flesh, and with divinity came the freedom to indulge, punish, and destroy without restraint. Their decadence was not only personal, it was structural, seeping into governance, justice, and the culture of obedience. And yet, there was fear even among the powerful. Caligula's assassination, Elagabalus's brutal removal, and Nero's forced suicide were reminders that while emperors could dominate flesh and law, they could not escape the consequences entirely. Roman elites, though terrified, acted when the corruption became too public, too dangerous, or too destabilizing. The empire survived these reigns of terror, but the psychological and cultural scars were deep, leaving a legacy that scholars, philosophers, and storytellers would explore for millennia. The Roman obsession with divine blood and purity of lineage compounded these horrors. Every emperor inherited the sins and flaws of his ancestors, magnified by expectations of perfection. Genetic disorders, mental instability, and congenital deformities were often interpreted as curses or divine punishment. But the real curse, as history reveals, was political and dynastic, the imperative to produce heirs to marry within a shrinking pool of elite families, and to preserve power at all costs, often at the expense of health, morality, and sanity. Imagine an empire where the personal, the political, and the pathological merge. Every intimate act is a statement, every indulgence a threat, every secret a weapon. The emperor's lives were a mirror reflecting the empire's darkest impulses. Lust was strategy, cruelty was ritual, and the consequences were etched into the annals of history, terrifying enough to make even the gods recoil. And this is only the beginning of our journey into the twisted corridors of power, where nothing is as it seems, and every pleasure hides a potential atrocity. In the shadows of the Palatine Hill, whispers of fear slithered through the corridors like smoke. Servants spoke of strange cries echoing at night, of masks dripping with candlelight shadows, and of emperors who feasted on spectacle as if it were sustenance. Rome's elite learned to walk lightly, speak softly, and never glance too long. Survival depended on the illusion that nothing could touch them, even as horror unfolded beneath the golden ceilings. Caligula's nights were a symphony of terror. The emperor would summon senators to watch him toy with gladiators, choosing life and death like a child picking flowers. Laughter would ripple through the room, mingling with screams, and the walls themselves seemed to absorb the tension, bearing witness to atrocities that blurred a performance and punishment. No moral compass guided these acts, only the perverse thrill of absolute dominion. Yet the true horror was subtler, the intimacy of betrayal. Loved ones, relatives, and confidants became instruments of control. One misstep in a conversation, one glance too long, could transform trust into a weapon. The emperor's whims became invisible chains, binding the powerful and the powerless alike, enforcing obedience through fear. In this empire, even affection had a price, and every smile could mask a threat. Nero's cruelty, escalated beyond spectacle. Entire neighborhoods were razed, and yet the emperor wandered among the ruins, singing and performing as if the agony of his people were mere scenery. Witnesses described the smell of burning homes mingling with perfume, a grotesque juxtaposition of beauty and horror. In Nero's presence, reality itself twisted, making fire appear festive and death resemble entertainment. Meanwhile, Tiberius perfected the art of unseen terror. His villas on Capri became stages for psychological games. Nobles were coerced, humiliated, and observed, while others were deliberately misled into betrayal. Every whispered rumor could incite panic, every shadow a source of dread. The young and old alike were caught in a web where morality, logic, and trust dissolved, leaving only instinct and survival. Even Elagabalus, in his flamboyant excess, imposed psychological strain on the court. Attendants never knew when divine favor would turn into cruelty. Prayers could be rewarded, laughter could be punished. Inconsistent rituals, sudden commands, and chaotic ceremonies kept the imperial household in a constant state of anxiety. It was a theater of power where fear, pleasure, and disorder were inseparable, and where the line between god and monster became indistinct. These emperors also manipulated perception beyond the palace. Public game sacrifices and processions were orchestrated to instill awe and terror simultaneously. Citizens were trained to accept the bizarre as divine, the cruel as lawful, and the horrific as ordinary. In effect, the empire itself became complicit, a society conditioned to tolerate, to observe, and to internalize fear as a structural component of governance. Behind closed doors, the personal consequences were severe. Heirs were born fragile, malformed, or mentally unstable, the result of dynastic incest and obsession with pure bloodlines. These conditions were interpreted as curses, yet they were manifestations of ambition and desperation. To maintain power, the ruling families prioritized inheritance over health, creating generations where genetic decay and human suffering were inseparable from political survival. And yet moments of vulnerability existed. Some emperors, isolated in their chambers, displayed a fleeting awareness of their fragility. Ancient chroniclers hint at sleepless nights, trembling hands, and eyes haunted by visions of retribution. These glimpses of humanity, however brief, made their public monstrosity even more chilling, the ruler aware of the horror he inflicted, yet unable or unwilling to stop. As we trace the corridors of power, one pattern emerges. The closer to absolute authority, the further from morality, empathy, and natural law. The emperor's bodies, minds, and lineages became instruments of a perverse experiment. And at the heart of it all was a terrifying paradox. Those who held the most power were often the most vulnerable, their greatness inseparable from their grotesque imperfections. This is the Shadow Empire, where legacy and decay, divinity and depravity were indistinguishable. In the dim corridors of the imperial palace, shadows seemed to have substance. Candles flickered against walls carved with triumphs and atrocities alike. Servants whispered of phantom footsteps of laughter that rose and fell like a heartbeat, and of the emperor's gaze that could chill the soul. Here, every corridor was a memory, every echo a warning, and every glance over the shoulder a potential sentence. Charles II's body, so grotesquely malformed, became the epicenter of rumors and dread. His jaw protruded, his limbs twisted, and his intelligence, though sharp in glimpses, was hampered by years of neglect and genetic decay. Courtiers called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one, imagining curses in every scar, every twitch, and every faltering step. They whispered that the devil himself had meddled in his creation, but truth was far more tragic. The palace, physicians, men of learning and superstition alike, documented horrors that science would only fully comprehend centuries later. Hydrocephaly, rickets, joint deformities, symptoms of generations of intermarried royalty. Charles's suffering was not mystical. It was the biological toll of obsession with dynastic purity. And yet to the court it remained a spectacle, a daily meditation on the limits of both power and the human form. But the psychological torment was equally severe. Servants, tutors, and family members constantly monitored the young king, whispering, correcting, and manipulating. Every meal, every word, every posture was scrutinized. A simple sneeze could be misinterpreted as weakness, a misstep as rebellion. For Charles, every breath was an act of negotiation with a court that feared and loathed him simultaneously. Outside the palace, the Spanish Empire trembled. Viceroys, generals, and clergy observed the king with both awe and anxiety. They wondered if the empire itself would falter if political decay mirrored the physical. In distant provinces, governors debated whether to act independently, uncertain if they were preserving Spain or merely prolonging a fragile illusion of stability. The king's infirmity was not just personal, it was a political contagion. At night, Charles would retreat to chambers that smelled faintly of incense and decay. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the scurrying of nocturnal animals or the occasional clink of a candle holder. In these moments, he seemed almost spectral, a living testament to the empire's contradictions, divine authority trapped in a body betrayed by generations of obsession with bloodlines. His court was a theater of paradox. Festivals and religious ceremonies juxtaposed luxury with fear music with subtle threats. Courtiers learned to smile while trembling to boo, while calculating. The king's mere presence reshaped behavior, teaching obedience through terror. Every elaborate display of piety masked the underlying horror. The ruler's fragility rendered the most powerful nobles equally vulnerable to rumor, error, and intrigue. History records that Charles II's decisions, though often indecisive, were meticulously influenced by advisors who understood both the throne's fragility and the empire's needs. They manipulated not only policies but perceptions, ensuring that the king remained sovereign in name, while power flowed through networks of fear, loyalty, and political calculation. The monarch became a symbol less a ruler than a living emblem of dynastic tragedy. And then there were the autopsy reports, documents that would haunt generations of physicians and historians alike. They revealed a body ravaged by inherited illness, misshapen and fragile, confirming the worst suspicions of contemporaries. The legends of curses and witchcraft paled before the clinical reality. Heredity had wrought a far more cruel fate than superstition could ever invent. Science finally explained what rumor had dramatized for decades. In the end, Charles II embodied the paradox of power, absolute authority, coupled with utter helplessness, divine command paired with profound vulnerability. His life was a cautionary tale written in flesh and bone, echoing through centuries as both horror story and moral lesson. The empire he inherited and the dynasty he represented would not survive unscathed. And yet the fascination persists, for nothing terrifies and enthralls like the intersection of human ambition, biological fate, and historical inevitability. Charles II's lineage was a labyrinth of interwoven bloodlines. Cousins married cousins, a practice intended to consolidate power, yet resulting in a web of genetic fragility. Every union meant to strengthen the dynasty instead amplified its vulnerabilities, and each child inherited not only the crown, but the accumulated weight of centuries of inbreeding. The palace itself seemed aware, echoing with whispers that the king's deformities were punishment for ambition too long unchecked. Observers noted that every generation brought new anomalies, malformed limbs, cognitive delays, fragile constitutions. These were not mere curiosities, they were warnings etched in flesh, a cruel calculus of heredity. Physicians attempted remedies, some crude, some bizarre, but none could reverse the curse embedded in DNA long before it was understood. Power had created its own poison, invisible, yet deadly. Within the court, political factions exploited these frailties mercilessly. Ministers and nobles maneuvered with the knowledge that the king's infirmity limited his authority. Every policy, every war, every treaty became a chessboard where Charles was more a piece than a player. The bewitched king ruled only in appearance, a puppet whose strings were pulled by ambition, fear, and survival instincts of those around him. The king's mental state, though often alert, was shaped by isolation and constant scrutiny. Tutors oscillated between harshness and indulgence, while courtiers observed for weakness. Every decision was questioned, every hesitation magnified. The young monarch learned early that his body and mind were spectacles, and survival required cunning as well as endurance. In these silent lessons, the court created a generation of politicians skilled in exploitation. Public perception of Charles was equally tragic. Rumors spread of miraculous cures and diabolical curses of alchemical experiments conducted in hidden chambers. Fear mixed with fascination, and commoners both pitied and shunned him. Paintings depicted his features with grotesque exaggeration, turning his reality into a canvas for collective anxiety and superstition. History remembers the spectacle more vividly than the man. In the bedrooms and libraries of the palace, Charles sought solace in books, prayer, and occasional companionship of rare confidants. Yet even here the shadow of genetic destiny loomed. He read of other kings of empires rising and falling, and perhaps wondered whether the same fate awaited Spain, a nation held together by fragile alliances, inherited weakness, and the illusions of continuity. The autopsy conducted after his death revealed what contemporaries feared but could not fully articulate. Bones were brittle internal organs malformed, and the brain showed signs of delayed development. Every symptom aligned with centuries of intermarriage and accumulated recessive traits. The legend of the Bewitched One had a scientific underpinning. Heredity had created what superstition dramatized, a horror more profound than any spell. Advisors and historians later noted that Charles II's reign, though officially uneventful, was a turning point for Spain. Decisions deferred alliances, fragile colonies neglected. These were the echoes of a king whose body and mind constrained him. The empire's decline was not sudden but inevitable, a slow unraveling accelerated by the genetic and psychological legacies of the royal house. Power, it seemed, was as much a liability as a privilege, and yet the human story remains compelling. Amid deformity and constraint, Charles demonstrated moments of insight, curiosity, and even humor. He corresponded with dignitaries, pondered reforms, and showed occasional affection for those around him. These glimpses into his character remind us that even in extreme fragility there is humanity, and even in horror there is story. The line between tragedy and fascination is thin, and history walks it with careful steps. As historians piece together his life, they realize that Charles II was both product and victim of a system that prized appearance, blood, and continuity over resilience, ethics, and foresight. The king's body, the dynasty's decay, and the empire's faltering were intertwined, an immutable equation of power, ambition, and biological reality. And for modern audiences, the Bewitched King remains a cautionary emblem, a reminder that human ambition can create monsters from within its own lineage. Charles's body, fragile and malformed, became a symbol whispered through generations. Courtiers would tell stories of his feeble movements, the struggle to lift a cup, or the contorted posture that made him seem almost inhuman. Yet these physical realities carried a heavier weight. They were visible evidence of a dynasty devoured from within by its own obsession with blood purity. Each deformity told a story, each weakness a warning unheeded. Within the royal chambers, advisors debated endlessly over succession. Every potential heir was scrutinized not only for political loyalty, but also for genetic soundness. The very idea of marrying within the family for power became a lethal gamble, each union potentially compounding the inevitable disaster. Some whispered that the curse of El Hechizado was not magic, but the inevitable arithmetic of human genetics pushed to extremes. The king's diet and medical care were carefully managed, yet even the best physicians could do little. Treatments ranged from bleeding and purges to obscure herbal concoctions. These interventions meant to strengthen the king often caused more harm than good, exacerbating frailties that were already written into his DNA. The palace itself became a theater of desperate experiments where fear masked as science guided every hand. Political intrigue intensified around Charles's condition. Ministers who outwardly showed loyalty would maneuver subtly, leveraging the king's incapacity for personal gain. Wars delayed treaties renegotiated, and colonies left vulnerable. All became the unintentional consequences of a monarch who could barely wield his own authority. The court was both protector and predator, encircling the king like vultures sensing weakness. Even the common people sensed the unnaturalness of their ruler. Tales spread in villages and marketplaces, a king who could not walk unassisted, a sovereign whose speech sometimes faltered, whose gaze seemed distant. These stories blurred fact and superstition, and for many the bewitched king embodied a living warning. Power pursued without wisdom can become a grotesque spectacle. Behind closed doors, Charles expressed moments of acute awareness. He questioned the legitimacy of inherited power, observed the self-serving strategies of those around him, and occasionally showed flashes of humor or sadness. Yet the body betrayed him a constant reminder that heredity had scripted a destiny beyond his control. He could reason, yet his own flesh limited his will, a paradox both tragic and haunting. Reports from foreign diplomats painted a grim picture. Ambassadors recorded every twitch, every hesitation, every visible deformity, exaggerating them for effect. Letters described him as a king, more shadow than flesh, and while some noted his intelligence, others interpreted weakness as evidence of moral or spiritual failing. The bewitched king became a canvas for European fears and prejudices, blending horror myth and science in one fragile frame. The palace archives preserved notes on his daily routines, hours spent lying down, rituals of grooming, meticulously observed exercises to maintain limited mobility. Yet these mundane details hinted at a life dominated by limitations, a sovereign whose power existed largely in title. The monarchy's glory was projected externally, while internally it contended with decay, vulnerability, and the relentless reminder of inherited frailty. When Charles II finally died, the autopsy confirmed centuries of speculation and fear. Bones fragile like dry twigs, organs malformed, and brain development delayed. Physicians recorded these horrors with clinical detachment, yet the accounts read like Gothic literature. The lineage of inbreeding, long ignored or excused for political expediency, had culminated in a human portrait of the cost of unchecked dynastic ambition. Historians later interpreted his life as a microcosm of the Spanish monarchy's decline. The empire had extended itself across continents, yet internally it was rotting. The bewitched king's body, the genetic legacy of centuries, and the political paralysis of his court intertwined to reveal an uncomfortable truth. Power preserved through isolation and intermarriage can create monsters, not leaders. As the years passed after Charles II's death, the stories of his condition became legend. Children in the streets were warned that ambition without caution could twist the body as it had twisted the king. Yet, beyond the folklore, scholars quietly studied his remains, piecing together a history written in bones and brittle tissue. The bewitched king's life had left a blueprint for understanding the perils of power misused. Political rivals used his story to caution heirs and kings elsewhere in Europe. Treatises on the dangers of inbreeding circulated warning that the pursuit of absolute control over succession could produce not heirs, but human tragedies. The very dynasty that had seemed invincible now served as an anatomical and moral case study. The empire's grandeur had hidden a deadly flaw within. The royal crypt, once a place of solemn honor, became almost a laboratory of fear. Anatomists and physicians who examined Charles II's remains recorded anomalies that confirmed every whispered suspicion: dwarfism, malformations, fragile organs, and cognitive delays. Each observation strengthened the narrative that this king, thought cursed by magic, was, in fact, a victim of lineage and human ambition run amok. Artworks and portraits of the era began to shift in tone. Painters could no longer simply depict royalty as godlike figures. In Charles's likeness, the subtle deformities, the weary posture, the haunted expression, all reflected the reality behind the crown. A symbol of decaying authority, the king's image became a cautionary emblem across Spain and beyond. Scholars later debated the curse of Charles II. Was it superstition or a cruel inevitability written in his genes? Modern medicine would eventually confirm what contemporary Europe could only sense. Centuries of repeated dynastic marriages had compounded rare recessive traits into an almost grotesque finality. The human body had become a ledger of political obsession, each deformity a line item in a ledger no one wanted to read. The empire itself faltered as heirs without adequate preparation or strength took the throne. Wars were lost, colonies fell, and influence waned. What remained was a cautionary tale. The grandeur of a nation could collapse not just from external enemies but from a lineage unwilling to respect the natural limits of life. Charles II's life was both mirror and warning, an empire's skeleton beneath its ornate veneer. Philosophers and moralists reflected on the tragic narrative. Power, they argued, is fragile when it is inherited rather than earned. Bloodlines cannot substitute for prudence, and genetic legacy cannot be ignored in the pursuit of dominion. The bewitched king's body, fragile and distorted, spoke to the eternal conflict between human ambition and biological reality. Modern audiences reading the accounts centuries later are confronted with a haunting truth. The most terrifying monsters are sometimes not supernatural, but the product of human choice compounded over generations. Charles II's life reminds us that obsession with purity control and unbroken power can create horrors that science can measure, but imagination cannot fully comprehend. In the shadows of history, the name El Hechizado lingers, not as a monarch triumphant, but as a symbol of human error codified in flesh. His death was not the end of a curse, but the revelation of a systemic failure. When dynasties ignore biology, neglect moderation, and worship authority above life itself, the outcome is inevitable: a slow, tragic decay visible to all who dare to look closely. So the next time you hear stories of kings cursed or haunted by fate, remember Charles II of Spain. The true horror lay not in magic or superstition, but in the relentless drive to preserve power, the blind loyalty to lineage, and the cruel arithmetic of inbreeding. Hit that subscribe button because the story of human ambition, its grotesque consequences, and the dark mirror it holds up to all of us is only just beginning.